I'm going to start as Muslims do in the name of God. In Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. To proceed, my dearest brothers and sisters in humanity, I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Peace be with you. Last session, we spoke about the linguistic miracle of the Qur'an from a philosophical perspective and a literary form perspective. If you remember, we said that the Qur'an is an act of impossibility, meaning that when we exhaust the nature of the event, which is the Qur'an, the nature being the Arabic language, the classical Arabic language, we exhaust all possibilities, all the 28 letters, the finite grammatical rules, the finite words. We cannot produce the unique literary form of the Qur'an. So it's an act of impossibility. We can't explain it naturalistically, therefore it's assigned to the supernatural. But I was listening to your mind, if you like, and you were probably saying, but I don't know anything about the Arabic language. How do I know you're speaking the truth, Mr. Hamza Tzortzis? How do I know these scholars, these Western academics you mentioned are actually right? Well, that's an interesting point. And this is why I want to articulate another argument which is based on the linguistic miracle, but in a way that you don't even need to know the first letter of the alphabet of the Arabic language. And this is called rational deduction. Now, rational deduction is a thinking process whereby we take a universally accepted statement and we draw logical conclusions. And the universally accepted statement concerning the Qur'an is that no one has been able to challenge the Qur'an. And we could trust this statement. Do you know why? Because it's based on authentic and valid testimony. And authentic and valid testimony is a source of knowledge. In the field of epistemology, the study of belief, we see the likes of Professor Cody, we see the likes of Professor Keith Lehrer. They discuss, and they are epistemologists in their own right, they discuss that authentic and valid testimony is knowledge. Let me prove this to you. How do you know China exists? I want proof from yourself that China exists. Now, many of us have never been to China, so let's assume that. But we still believe China exists. Now you may think, well, I've spoken to a Chinese person before. Is that proof? Sounds like testimony to me. I could come up to you and say, I am a Fufulonian. I come from the planet Fufula. Does that mean it's true just because I said so? Now you may think, well, I went to a Chinese shop, I had Chinese food. Yes, but did you have it in China? No. I can open a shop and say, welcome to Fufulonian hospitality. And you're going to be eating Fufulonian special dishes, which is herb-crusted lizard and salt-baked, I don't know, mice. Whatever the case may be. But the point is that true? Does it imply that Fufula exists and Fufulonian hospitality is true? No, it doesn't. This is testimony. And you may say, well, I saw it on a map. Okay, so if I gave you a new map, 2013 edition, and I said, here's the island, it's the shape of a diamond in the Pacific Ocean, it's called Fufula. Doesn't mean it's true, it's still testimony, it's still secondary source. So essentially our belief that China exists is actually based on testimony. It's recurrent, authentic, valid testimony, something in the Islamic Arabic tradition called mutawatir reporting. Because so many people en masse have reported that China exists and they've never met each other. To claim that China is not true is to claim a mass conspiracy. So testimony is a valid source of knowledge. So we could justify the universally accepted statement, which is no one has been able to challenge the Qur'an because the authentic and valid testimony by Eastern and Western scholarship agrees with that universally accepted statement. For example, we have Professor Arbuthnot. He said that although several attempts have been made to challenge the Qur'an, none have yet succeeded. So, the universally accepted statement stands. And this universally accepted statement still stands even if people disagree with it, because it's based on valid and authentic testimony, a consensus, the majority. So, if this is true, no one has been able to challenge the Qur'an from a linguistic and literary perspective, then let's draw the logical conclusions. And we don't even need to know Arabic. Number one, it came from an Arab. Number two, it came from a non-Arab. Number three, it came from the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. Number four, it came from God. If there's any other option, please let me know, because these are the valid options that we know of. So let's go to number one. Could it have come from an Arab? Well, this is impossible because even the best Arabs of the time failed to change the Qur'an. Like Walid ibn al-Mughira, he was the famous linguist of the time, and he said, by God, this cannot come from a human being. Also, we know that there are so many motivations for people to challenge the Qur'an at that time. Because the Arabs didn't want Islam to flourish, because it went against the social, economic dynamic of the society. And the Qur'an says, you want to disprove Islam, then bring a chapter like it. And they failed to do so. The best linguists of the time. So we know it couldn't be the best Arabs. Well, some people may say, what about contemporary Arabs in Egypt or in Syria? Well, this is false as well, because if you think about it, these cultures are what you would call linguistically heterogeneous cultures, whereas there is a influx of different languages and there's a far more aspect of linguistic borrowing or linguistic degeneration than any other time. Whereas at the time of Arabia, it was far more homogeneous. Although you did have linguistic borrowing, but this linguistic borrowing was a naturalization of the language, which means if the Arabic language took something from Greek, it would then bring it and naturalize it into the Arabic language. It wasn't just be a crude borrowing like we have today. For example, if you go to Egypt and you ask someone how to say telephone, they'll probably say to you, telephone. How do you say the TV? Television. So essentially, it's a crude way of talking about this, but essentially I'm saying that there's a linguistic degeneration. So how can we expect anything profound from a unique literary perspective from a society that is a product of a linguistic degenerated society? So it's irrational. So therefore, it can't come from an Arab. What about a non-Arab? Well, this is false as well, because how could it be? You have to know Arabic to produce a unique literary form of Arabic. It's as simple as that. What about Muhammad, upon whom be peace? Maybe it was from Muhammad, he was a genius, as some Orientalists claim. Well, let's look at it logically. Muhammad was an Arab too. Arabs failed, therefore Muhammad did not bring the Qur'an. He was not the author. It's as simple as that. But we also have various other arguments. I studied psychology at university, and an aspect of psychology is studying psycholinguistics. And if you see, for example, the scholars of Shakespeare, they know Shakespeare's work because of the style, because of the emotive content. This is called the emotive literary character of a certain piece, psycholinguistics. So we know Homer wrote the Iliad or wrote other pieces, or we know an author writes certain pieces because his character is in the text. So we know Shakespeare is Shakespeare because a bit of Shakespeare is in Shakespeare. But when we read the Qur'an, there is no Muhammad, upon whom be peace, from a literary emotive perspective, from a psycholinguistic perspective. When we do any type of linguistic analysis, it remains in the divine voice. Even though the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, had a 23-year prophetic career, if you like, of emotional roller coaster, and none of these emotions are in the divine text, it remains in the divine voice. So it couldn't have come from Muhammad, upon whom be peace. We also know his prophetic traditions, known as hadith or ahadith. The linguistic genre of these traditions are in distinct style to the Quranic discourse. So how can someone maintain this over 23 years without mixing them together in any form of way? Especially if these verses were revealed instantaneously in many cases. So we know it couldn't have come from Muhammad, upon whom be peace. But we have many other arguments too, because in any human expression, you have to understand that if the blueprint of the expression is there, whether it's art or anything else, it can be replicated. For example, you can have retrospective engineering. For example, I think recently Iran stole a drone from America or something and built its own drone. It did retrospective engineering, or China did something similar. When we have art, for example, we have replicas. If you have the known piece available, you can see the texture, the style, the brushstrokes, the material used. So any blueprint available, if it's human expression, can be replicated. But the Quran is available today. We have the blueprint, we have the sound, the letters, the rhythm, the style, the form, but we can't use that blueprint to replicate it. So we see that it couldn't have come from Muhammad, upon whom be peace. Therefore, the best explanation is that it must have come from God. And you didn't even need to know anything about the Arabic language. You just have to accept a universally accepted statement and then draw logical conclusions. That's all you have to do. So this is a key, unique argument substantiating that the Quran is from the divine. We have good reasons to believe it's from the divine, because it couldn't have come from an Arab, it couldn't have come from a non-Arab, it couldn't have come from Muhammad upon whom be peace, and it couldn't have, and therefore it must have come from God. Now there is a minor contention which doesn't come from an atheist community or an agnostic community. It comes from a traditional community like Christians. And I remember giving this lecture at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and a Christian academic stood up and said, well, maybe it came from the devil. I responded by saying, well, how do you know the devil exists? And he said, well, because the Qur'an tells us. But that means he's affirmed the Qur'an to be true, because if he believes what the Qur'an says, that a devil exists, the unseen exists, therefore that very proposition justifies that the Qur'an is from the divine. So I said to him, try again. And he said, okay, well, maybe because the Bible says so. So, well, that's fair enough, but these things are concerning the unseen, and you need to prove the unseen to me via some form. So therefore, you have to prove now the Bible is from God. And he couldn't do so, because we know from a contemporary academic perspective, if we read the works of Dr. Brutes Metzger and Dr. Bart Ehrman and other scholars concerning the historicity and textual integrity of the Bible, we know what the Bible today is not the Bible that we're supposed to have 2,000 years ago, because if you look at all the variants, not one of them agree with each other. There's around 7,000 plus New Testaments in the Greek language up to the 19th century, and not one of them are in total agreement with each other. So it's not a preserved text, so what text are we talking about? Therefore it can't be from the divine. Therefore to claim this is a valid source of knowledge about the devil is an invalid source of knowledge. So that contention wasn't a very strong one. Thank you very much for listening.